patience, everybody, whilst we reset the stage. We're moving on to our next panel discussion, which is the supply chain sustainability forum. There's an awful lot for us to get through, so I will start with our introductions, starting on the far side. Closest to me, we have Rachel Moseley, Director of Sustainability at LSEG. We have Amy Barnes with us, Head of Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy at Marsh. Hannah Bell, Senior Procurement Sustainability Manager at Haleon, a GSK company. And we have, last but not least, Aleksandra Klassen, Client Development Manager at Schneider Electric. Thank you all for joining us. Full biographies of all of our guests are available on the app, which means I don't have to sit here reading all their biographies out, which is always slightly awkward when people are sitting next to you. So do look out for those as well. So we are looking at the supply chain sustainability situation, and particularly where I'm going to start with is how companies can make sure suppliers are reaching the right standards. I know there's technology options now which should in theory make things easier, but Rachel, I'll start with you. How do you feel companies can make sure that they're hitting the right standards?
So I'm part of LSEG, London Stock Exchange Group, so our supplier base is pretty mundane, to be completely honest with you, but that doesn't mean to say that that's not a challenge still. You know, we're not producing things using palm oil or things like that, but we've got a supply chain of probably 5,000. So that actually means that we have a really, really big responsibility to ensure that we're setting a bar. And I think, to go to your question, that we can't really ensure it, but we can certainly set a bar and set expectations. And we'll go into this, I'm sure, more in the panel as well. So minimum standards, policies, more than legislation, data collection. I mean, the list goes on, really. But ensuring, we can't really do, but maintaining standards, engaging with our suppliers and kicking off conversations with some suppliers who maybe aren't in that trajectory as yet is absolutely key.
Amy?
I completely agree. Ensure is a really big word, and I don't think any of us would be brave enough to say that, but I think it starts with the mapping, understanding the extent of your supply chain, and it's relatively easy, or at least should be, to understand your tier 1 suppliers, but going below that to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, understanding the connections, I think is the first real challenge that a lot of people have. Sometimes because those suppliers may feel that their upstream supply chain is sort of proprietary and confidential, so that can be a real challenge. But once you have a map of that digital twin, that knowledge graph, that understanding, then it starts with the digital tools to collect information where that's available, but also engagement. But I think ensure feels a bit too big a word.
It does indeed. Hannah?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, unlike the two supply chains that we've just mentioned here, Haleon, we manufacture products like Sensodyne, Aquafresh, so consumer healthcare products, which do have supply chains which are linked to things like palm oil, mint, different materials like agricultural. So for us, that kind of supplier integration and that supplier communication is definitely fundamental for everything that we do to obviously ensure that those materials are sustainable. So I think the tools and the techniques that we've been using as a business, as a supply chain and as a procurement function is very much aligned to a lot of the tools and processes that we have already established within the business. So making it really easy for like our procurement category managers or our stakeholders to actually embed sustainability and that education with suppliers. So I could just give an example of that is making sure that any tenders that we do, any RFQs with suppliers, sustainability is embedded into that as a requirement. So first of all, you're completely understanding how mature that supplier is in sustainability and how much you can work, what work you need to do with them. The second part would then be obviously to embed it into kind of contracts, a standard really review as part of the business and supplier review meetings to make sure that they are meeting the expectations, and where they're falling short, how we can support them with that as well. Maybe if I can just give one example of how we've done that is this year we did our first Haleon supplier sustainability event. So in that event, there was over 200 people, completely virtual. It was a 3-hour session, and what we did was we included all of our suppliers and set out expectations of what we as a business need them to do to support us on this sustainability agenda. So it covered everything from carbon reduction, sustainable sourcing, human rights, water. So what we did was we set these expectations with suppliers and were really clear with them what we wanted them to do. But on the back of that, we also gave some educational sessions to those suppliers of how they can actually meet that. Because I think it's all very well and good saying you need to do X, Y, and Z. But if you've got a supplier who's small, potentially diverse, they don't really know kind of exactly the right steps to take, then we wanted to give them that education as well on how to do that.
Aleksandra.
Yeah, I'm just going to say same for everything. But I guess I'm wearing 2 hats today, Schneider Electric, because we're both a practitioner. Obviously, we have a very long supply chain. We're currently working with our top 1,000 suppliers that represent over 90% of our emissions. But also as a practitioner, as a provider, because we have essentially end-to-end supply chain decarbonization programs that we do for clients. So I completely agree with Rachel's point around initially setting that bar. So if your suppliers don't see that you're serious about reducing your carbon footprint, then why would they follow suit? Setting targets specifically for Scope 3, we're seeing more and more companies do that as well. And Schneider Electric has a target to reduce our Scope 3 emissions by 35% by 2030. And then, making sure that you're really looking at the baseline, calculating those emissions, because, as you said, Hannah, especially smaller companies are not going to be able to do a lot of this initially. It's a bit of a whirlwind when you first start to get involved, even larger companies. So I think making sure, again, setting that bar, leadership, communication, and then collaborating with your suppliers, which I'm sure we'll be talking about much more detail.
Well, that moves me on very nicely to where I wanted to go next, because setting that bar and setting those standards is part of the challenge. Monitoring it and making sure those standards are being kept is, I guess, the second part of that. Where would you all stand on how is best to go about monitoring that kind of performance? It's all well and good setting the standards, saying this is what we expect. You have to make sure people are actually reaching that. I'll open this up to all of you. What is the best way from your experience of monitoring it and making sure those standards are being met?
Maybe I'll go first for this one.
Of course.
So digital tools are a great way of doing that. At Schneider, we have a whole suite of services under Zygo, the brand of Zygo, that essentially not only help companies to do that kind of baselining, understanding which facilities are the most difficult for them to decarbonize, doing energy site audits, really understanding that landscape first. But then we also have Zygo Activate for SMEs. So that's like a simplified process. But essentially, once you can't manage what you can't measure. So once that baseline is set, then there are the tools that basically enable the companies to see how they're progressing, because they can also set roadmaps, set a target themselves, and then essentially the supply chain programs that we have where we work with sponsors, they're able to onboard their suppliers. We manage that process. We do the education series for them, and then the supplier sponsors are able to see actually how their suppliers are progressing and how they are meeting their targets. So it's the entire kind of journey to actually acting and making those decisions around different decarbonization levers like renewable energy or circularity, energy efficiency, or electrification.
I was just going to say on the back of that as well, I think the monitoring piece, when you mentioned about bringing it into kind of the suppliers and then into the business, and how the business need to kind of really own that as well. So I think the kind of the capability around the business and working with suppliers, how is a business set up to really facilitate those conversations and measure with suppliers. I don't think it should, it's not just down to the sustainability team to have a conversation with, like you said, got multiple thousands of suppliers. The kind of the education with procurement functions, with supply chain needs to be there to be able to kind of monitor and facilitate those discussions. So yeah, we've kind of been working internally with our teams to be able to kind of set them up to have a bit of a springboard to facilitate conversations. So, you know, how you can potentially track a supplier through contract clauses, potentially looking at KPIs, embedding it into your business review meetings. How does it become a natural kind of organic part of your business, like you would monitor cost, risk and quality with your suppliers? That's kind of how we're trying to do that as well with sustainability.
I couldn't agree more. It's the embedding and it's the empowering colleagues and the education and the training. So this just becomes the way we do things. We sort of talk about sustainability data as if it's a thing out there on the side to be owned by sustainability teams, but the more that we consider it just data that the business uses for decision making. I think we're seeing some really interesting development in AI tools as well to track and understand some of the alerts that we see. The concern with generative AI, when we see that being used to assess sustainability, is its potential to hallucinate, and so just not quite knowing the veracity of the information. But that can be really useful because the news sources around the world can give you a great insight. The challenge there is that most of the information you get is in English language. It's very difficult to get good AI that is speaking in sort of some of, or that is reading in some of the less well-known languages. So I think that's a key way to start implementation as well. I come at this very much from a risk perspective because all of our organisations make commitments about the way we behave, and so it's really important to us that we live and deliver what we behave, and so keeping on top of those alerts is critical to make sure you're not making statements that are ultimately found to be flawed.
And I'd also say it's all very well and good collecting the data, but what are you going to do with it? I mean, we've said it's not up to, you know, sustainability experts to sit there and be like, oh, okay, and going through in granular detail thousands of data points. So it's actually understanding what you're collecting and why, and then how that's going to inform decisions. Because, you know, take carbon, for instance. We're taking carbon emission data out of our from our suppliers to understand it, to help inform our Scope 3 purchase goods and services. That's amazing. What else are we asking? Why are we asking them? What are we doing about human rights? Where's modern slavery? What is their minimum standards around kind of other compliance? You know, have we seen media alerts on things around greenwashing? Like all of this information, we could collect all the information in the whole world, but if it's not then being used to inform decisions, then it's a job half done, basically.
I want to return to something you touched on there briefly, Amy, and that's about new technology. I also work across our Procurement magazine, another one of our sister titles, which you may have seen on the board out there. It's a fabulous read, another gratuitous plug, I apologise for that. And there's barely a day goes by when I don't get another press release or alert about this new all-singing, all-dancing toy that will work on this part of the procurement process or the supply chain process, which is the silver bullet for solving all problems. They're all very, very exciting. But with so many big new ideas, new technology, new business models, startups cropping up all over the place, there's so many of them around at the moment. And Amy, I'll start with you on this because you mentioned AI. Which ones of them sort of excite you most? Which of these new technological advances excite you most in terms of being genuinely useful in creating a sustainable supply chain?
I think you've got to ask yourself the question first, what question are you trying to answer? How are you going to use the data? What actionable insights are you going to generate from that? Because some of the data platforms, I think, do run the risk of being data for data's sake, as opposed to if you're thinking about your category manager, and your category manager already has a really busy job, how do they ingest that information? How does it inform their decision making? So I think it's actually how do the tools embed within existing business processes this can become BAU. I do think there are some really exciting developments for people in what I'd call the real economy, manufacturing rather than professional and financial services, but people in the real economy. The ability to track goods and services as they cross borders, I think, is very exciting. I think we need to be aware that we've got real blind spots when we see commodities moving, sort of intra-China, intra-Schengen. It's very difficult to track commodities, but there's some interesting developments there. Some really interesting uses of visual intelligence, so satellite data to actually verify, because if you're thinking, as we think, especially about carbon, and as we think more about nature risk, being grounded in place and space is even more important. Just having a company name for your supplier isn't going to answer the question. So using visual intelligence and satellite data to actually locate the asset and to understand the footprint. Lots of cool AI, which sounds cool. Let's see if it informs insight and decision making. So without naming names of providers, I think there's some of the technologies I'm watching closely.
I'll open it up to the panel, sorry.
I was going to say, one thing that we've actually discovered is within our own supply chain, having solutions within that. So, I mean, I don't know what size people's businesses are and things, but obviously we're all part of a bigger value chain, and these conversations are ongoing from both a customer and a supplier perspective. And actually some of our suppliers who are working in different spaces are working in data and pieces like that. And then a shameless plug, London Stock Exchange Group, we aren't just the exchange, we're so much more, but we also have financial data and information. So commodities tracking, tick. World check, you know, where are the risks within your supply chain? Tick. So we actually have a lot of tools under our own belt that we can use and enable. But shockingly, it's actually quite hard to use your own stuff because you forget about it. So again, like look actually within your own four walls or a bit further out to see what's there, because there might be stuff under your nose that you weren't aware of.
I'll pass that down the line. Any other of the new technologies which particularly excite you at the moment?
Yeah, maybe just to add on, I think, again, the question of what are you using this technology for? And then if you kind of break apart what a supply chain management program, right, for yourself, if you're in that kind of build phase, the act phase, and maybe accelerating your progress, right? I think there's going to be different tools for those different stages. But what we've seen working with our own suppliers and on the other projects that we work on for clients is that when it actually comes down to taking action, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement and communication that is required, and AI is never going to be able to do that, right? That's its limitation. So I guess a word of caution that as these solutions are developing, I think is really important to make sure that you're not necessarily jumping to a technology solution that sounds really cool because it could have some repercussions later down the line. And again, right now, companies are struggling with internal resources to even understand. So I think we're going to see many more tools coming up, but making sure that you're communicating with your suppliers and engaging them is, I think, going to be really critical.
Yeah, just off the back of that comment, linking to a conversation I think we had earlier in terms of the data and the technologies and the vast amount of kind of different options that are out there. Sometimes we can get a little bit lost in trying to make sure that we've got the perfect technology, the most accurate data, and it's taken away that from the time that we should actually be working directly one-on-one with these suppliers, you know, with the supply chain to actually, you know, decarbonize or for sustainable sourcing. So I think it's also a bit of a kind of a call out to, similar to what you just said, just to be careful with the vast amount that kind of are coming up. They can be great, but not to take away from the work that we need to do to really kind of move the needle. Looking
at other challenges, though, that companies may have about promoting a sustainable supply chain and achieving one, for you, let's break down what some of those big challenges are. I'll start with you, Rachel, on this one, as you're closest to me. I apologise for that. For you, what do you see as the big challenges for actually reaching that point where you feel you've got a sustainable supply chain in place?
The biggest challenge for us absolutely is education and understanding and knowledge, both within our own business and also the supply chain, about the why. And that is because this space has shifted, changed, moved rapidly, even in the last 2-3 years. You know, everyone's talking about Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 is more than purchase goods and services, but purchase goods and services, your supply chain, what that looks like is absolutely I was going to say the elephant in the room. It's not, we're talking about the elephant, but it is very much the piece that everyone wants to know about. But the knowledge, both within organisations, hasn't moved that quickly. And that is not a blame thing at all, but think about the role of a category manager. The role of a category manager isn't to understand deep decarbonisation within their own business, but should it be? So it's things like that, and exactly as Hannah was saying earlier as well, you know, working with those suppliers to educate them, you know, what's happening, but also on our side as well, to equip our category managers with these conversations. We talk a lot about how we're engaging, educating and equipping our colleagues for the future, for sustainability, and this is absolutely one of the key focus areas for us. So it would be knowledge, understanding and education from both sides.
Okay, that's one challenge. I'll take that down the line.
My answer was going to be virtually identical, I'm afraid, because as I have 55,000 colleagues, and actually how does what we're talking about inform their decision-making processes? How do we educate, train, make it really consistent? I can't remember who it was that said earlier on the panel, but also having a consequence. What's the consequence of some of the red flags we may see? And I think that's really challenging, to be clear within your own business. When you may have a critical supplier who fails to meet an objective, what's the approach that you take? Because it does need to be collaborative. This isn't you can just penalise straight away. So education and training, I think, at the moment for me.
Well, before I go on to other challenges, if I could push that on another step when it comes to that education and communication, how have both of you, as you've raised this as an example, apologies, actually had success in cutting through and making sure those messages land? What tactics, approaches have you done to actually make those approaches land?
We've done a couple of things over the last year. Actually, it's been a direct project and also an objective within group procurement as well, which is to host a number of education sessions for them. So that's, sustainability experts coming in, talking to category managers, group procurement at large, and saying, by the way, this is what climate change is, this is what scope is, just from an environmental perspective, and then what is human rights, what is due diligence. So a real sort of 101, which is really belittling it, because obviously we know this isn't like a 101, it's like huge systemic stuff. And then we've also been facilitating education sessions with our tier 1 suppliers as well, saying you are in scope of our science-based target, for instance. What is an emission? What is this? So we have been doing a bit of a back to school really for these suppliers. So we've kind of taken ownership of the fact that we know this is a gap. So how can we actually fill that gap and be proactive in that? So that's what we've done.
To be really brief, just thinking about our own colleagues, we debated long and hard whether to make this training mandatory or not. And we opted on not, because we didn't want it to feel like a tick box exercise. I work in financial services, so there's a lot of compliance training. We wanted to encourage engagement. And so doing that, we've still had thousands of people come through the course. We have made it compulsory as an onboarding. So we're trying to be really thoughtful about how do we make people feel that this is something that's good for their careers, that they want to be interested in, has been a key objective of ours. But I want to pass.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've done something similar. We've at Haleon created what we've called a Sustainability Academy. So it's not just for procurement or supply chain, but it's for the full business. And these are kind of bite-sized modules that you can get on your phone, audio, kind of on the go, where it's kind of broken it down topic by topic, kind of 10-minute bite size into, what is climate change, carbon reduction, what are the 3 big initiatives that you need to go after, etc. So I think that definitely building that capability is something that is critical. And then I think that then leads me on, if I can, to one of the next challenges, which I think we have seen kind of embedding sustainability and kind of with the whole programme, is around cost. So obviously I work in a kind of a procurement function, which is stereotypically looking at cost savings, driving value for the business, which it still is, the bread and butter that's what we're there for. However, it's going beyond that now to look at, to get an FFC certification for paper with our paper suppliers might be a little bit more expensive in terms of our standard cost, but looking at it more holistically and looking at the long-term strategy of the business and what consumers want. So although cost is seen as a bit of a blocker or a challenge, it's educating people to understand, well, don't just look at it from a procurement perspective, but from a business perspective. If you're going to lose out on sales, what's that going to do in terms of cost for the business overall? So again, it really brings back to that educational piece of not just training kind of function by function, but having it across the business so that people understand what decisions each function takes and how that affects the overall kind of sustainability strategy as well, I think is super important.
Aleksandra?
Yeah, I think I'd say probably from our experience, on one hand, it's the ability to take all of this information, it sounds like you guys are doing really great engagement programs and training, and it's interesting that in your roles you are having to do that, right? It's not part of your core business, But yeah, so taking those trainings, and then what do then the suppliers do, right? They, again, some have more of a homogenous supply chain. We have a very vast one. So half of our suppliers are based in Asia, roughly half. The ones that we are working with, then US, Europe. So then it's which options are available in those countries, for example. So then you get into a whole different tier of information around then how do you take action and what is actually available. And one thing that we found that has been really a kind of cornerstone of what we're doing is trying to aggregate some of the suppliers to be able to go to market for some renewable energy solutions, for example, together. So basically, they increase their buying power, and then they wouldn't have been able to engage in this kind of more of a kind of risky long-term procurement approach that's like meant for companies that are larger or have better credit ratings. So it's this kind of consortium approach, which we've done for Walmart, which we're doing for different programs, including Energize for a pharmaceutical industry-wide program. So it's taking them all the way through what are the different actions that are possible. And then just lastly, I would say maybe around working with whole industries and trying to basically get synergies, because a lot of them share suppliers, right? So we have this with Energize, we have this with Catalyze, a new program that we've launched for the semiconductor industry. And a lot of these industries and companies want to collaborate. The pharmaceutical, we have 20 sponsors. They really wanted to collaborate. But there's a lot of challenges around that, right? So it's identifying some of the shared suppliers and making that information clear in terms of what are the benefits of actually working together, because then we could just accelerate decarbonization in that way.
So I guess there's a lot of benefits that you could foresee if you're putting various things in place, education programs or so on in place. For all of you, I always like to find out about the unexpected benefits, when different measures and ideas have been put in place and things have happened that you didn't necessarily expect to happen that have been a huge benefit. And I appreciate this is a slightly off the ball question, but have you got any examples of benefits you didn't foresee coming when it came to putting these sort of practices in place?
Very happy to start. So I work in risk. So for me, a benefit is avoiding a risk. So just so we're clear. And when we
have you got that on mug somewhere? I think you must do.
So when we think about some of the risks we're concerned in supply chains. Hannah's had some really cool jobs, and one of the, and a lot of your work is still working with farmers. And so, how can we think about not just how is that farmer behaving in a sustainable way, but what's the potential for climate change to impact our certainty of supply around that commodity, whatever that may be? How can climate change impact the infrastructure? So when we think about climate, we think about flooding. In my world, we often think about rain. We think about water in terms of damage. Too much water, we have damage to flooding. Too little water, well, when it's a manufacturing input or an agricultural input, we get stress. But it's also infrastructure. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the drought in the Mississippi River last year. And 67% of US grain gets exported through the Mississippi River. So in a time where we have the Ukraine war and grain shortages, grain couldn't get to market and crops were being left in the field. But the one that blew me away was one of my aviation clients in the US who couldn't get glycol to their airports to de-ice their planes because the Mississippi was on drought. Well, obviously they did, but instead of using a barge, they had to use the equivalent of a barge is either 16 rail cars or 70 semi-trucks, and that's a much higher carbon footprint of that commodity. So understanding where all those risks and those vulnerabilities to climate change sit in your supply chain, in my world, is a benefit.
Just following on from that, I think, when we looked at our supply chain in terms of some of the risks that have then led to opportunities and kind of positive programs, is that we purchase various different materials, obviously mint being one of them, which is grown by farmers that supports kind of oral healthcare products. That was one of a key product for us in terms of our revenue, in terms of the actual impact on water, climate. So we wanted to look at that product and take a more specific or detailed detailed approach with that. So when we were looking at the industry, there's no kind of industry standard for mint like you would RSPO for palm or FFC for paper. So we've done a lot of work as a business with kind of farmers on the ground that's led to huge positive improvements or programs that are underway. So working with farmers on their kind of sanitation, working with them to on good agricultural practices, which is something that initially we didn't know was going to evolve from this programme, but looking kind of at the risks and mitigating our supply chain, that's something that, that positive work is underway.
Okay, anything further either of you would add to that? Unexpected benefits?
Maybe just on my last point that I mentioned, this kind of collective action in industries, I think we probably didn't expect that the kind of the ecosystem that develops from basically connecting companies, and again, this kind of overlap of suppliers, it's a whole new universe that kind of opens up, which obviously has positive business outcomes in terms of engaging with companies more, but just how much you can accelerate quicker in collaborating in that kind of way.
I think, sorry, I was just going to say something on the back of that we mentioned as well around having the awareness that suppliers and your supply chain are going to be at different maturity levels. So you might get a supplier who's super mature that you might be able to learn from them. So as a business, we can learn from them. They can, other suppliers can learn from them. But then we've also got suppliers who are a lot less mature or a lot less educated in terms of what do they need to do, to reduce their carbon footprint, for example. So that's one of the opportunities that we've tried to take is with those less mature suppliers is supporting them, whether it's with funding or with our knowledge or resource to create a product carbon footprint, for example, so that they've then got something to measure against. So I think, once you kind of delve deep into the supply chain, there are definitely kind of benefits that come from some of those issues as well.
And I'd also just pick up and say that we're being asked these exact same things by our customers as a supplier. So we've been having some incredibly useful conversations with our customers about the standards that they're setting within their supply chain, of which we're one of them, and then seeing how that trickles through the value chain, or understanding actually that some of the expectations they're placing on us are pretty heavy-handed, and do we want to have that approach with our own suppliers? So it's been a very interesting way for us to understand how this supply web is influencing, and it's a bit of a ripple.
Okay, I will come to the room now, as there is I had a feeling hands were going to shoot up, and they absolutely have. I believe Charlie is appearing at the back with a microphone, just at the very front row at the far end in the white shirt.
Hello, hi. I'm Dr. Shiva from iBank. I just come from the other side of the world, India and China. I just had 40 days of some tour around on the investment banking and something. I can see two different sides of the world now. Because if you see the production and most of the factories and everything coming from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, and they are the more producing of carbon. And here we are talking about education, their poverty line, whether goods or the production of goods, and the farmers and the factory workers are below poverty line. We are sitting here, financial services, talking about education. And I can see it's too much cliche, so I would expect more controversial. It sounds controversial. I was thinking like more, I was listening to the transport, which is a good one. And your one also good, but of course you have to do it through education. But I was thinking more bolder points. Otherwise, the sentiment will shift. If the people say organic, immediately the price went up. ULEZ congestion charges, it's finally come to the users. So when you put this one also, if we just only talk about education or anything, the price will go up, but do we get the real benefit out of it? So that's what my question.
I think if we can sort of refine that into a slightly more direct question, you covered a lot of points there. So is your question more about how we've got to pay closer attention to other parts of the world rather than our own doorstep? Is that a fair roundup of your question? Because you got through a lot of points there. So we'll take that as the question then. do we feel we do need to maybe look further than our borders to actually to make these improvements when it comes? I appreciate it's quite a broad question.
I was going to say I can kind of maybe take a stab at answering that one, because completely agree that I think what we've seen in our supply chain is some of the suppliers from areas like India, for example, they're not getting the education that potentially we are, and yet we've been asking them to do the exact same thing as a supplier from London, for example, and it's just not necessarily fair. So that's why we are trying to take a slightly different approach, where we measure our suppliers in terms of their current maturity, and then support them. So, for example, we do have a supplier from India who supports one of our key brands, and they didn't have the education or the awareness of what a product carbon footprint is. So when we ask them to reduce their footprint by 50% by 2025, they obviously don't know how to do that. So we've taken kind of that accountability and responsibility, as they are a key supplier to us, to fund their life cycle analysis and product carbon footprint, and support them with kind of educating them on, what's the waste in their supply chain, how do they bring down their footprint, what options do they have to move to renewables, for example. So we are trying, but I think, there definitely needs to be more emphasis on that as well.
Okay, thank you for fielding that one, Hannah. There were quite a few other hands that went up, so I will move on. I believe just in the centre row here was the next hand to go up. Can I just see where the other hands went up? I'm just struggling to see in the light. I've got 1, 2, 3, I think it was. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jenny Wardle. I wear several hats, but this one is with regard to, I'm on the all-party parliamentary group for Women in Enterprise, and we're looking at sustainability in SMEs. And just what other support small companies might need. Appreciate you are bigger companies, but wondering what you might feel the government could do to support the change. At the moment you're all beavering away, you're all learning, making similar mistakes probably and so on. Is there anything that could help in that? Or is there anything that if the government caused a compliance issue, which maybe don't want, but what could be helpful just to make it faster? Because you're all doing it and you know what you're saving, but as a country, do we know what we're saving?
Aleksandra made a really good point about collaboration, but we find we're quite nervous about collaboration because of antitrust regulations, even where we're trying to move an agenda forward. So having clarity on how to move forward in an efficient, collaborative way without falling foul of the law. I mean, there have been times where we've been trying to get to an agenda and the first 4 months have been trying to navigate antitrust, and that doesn't feel like an efficient use of our time, albeit it's sensible regulation.
Any other further notes on that? No, we'll move on to the next question. Thank you very much for that one. We have 2 over there, so we'll take the blue shirt first, and then I have no idea what colour you're wearing because I'm staring directly into the stage lights, but if you could pass it on afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jack Tennant. I'm an originator at Drax. I'm just going back to the discussion on innovative solutions and Scope 3 emissions. I'm wondering what your views are on the role of carbon removals versus carbon offsets in tackling hard-to-abate Scope 3 emissions.
I will talk very, very quickly. I think there is a role, but there's a right role for them. And actually, I'm sure that Aleksandra's got a lot to say on that one based on her role. But yeah, there absolutely is. I think that there has been a huge amount of noise in the press around carbon offsets, some rightly and some wrongly. And I think that we as people who are all trying to get to the same thing need to be a bit human in that as well. Companies can't be penalised for doing something that they see as having a real-world impact, which I thoroughly believe most of those projects have real-world impact and are changing lives. But I do think that there does seem to be a bit of humanity from us all working in this space about kind of what companies are trying to do and the sort of new things coming at us about what we shouldn't be doing and why we shouldn't be doing. But I completely agree there is a role for it, but it's not the only answer to the problem.
Yeah, and if I can just add on, Rachel, I think completely agree with what you're saying. I also think that carbon offsets and carbon removals come into the chain when dealing with harder to abate emissions, right? And you're seeing that with science-based targets as well, where they're letting you, as a company, basically cordon off a certain percentage of your emissions for carbon offsets. So it definitely has a role. Does require more scrutiny, and it's fairly new, right? When new things come onto the market, there's going to be a lot of kind of like volatility around that. So more scrutiny, but sure, some of these projects are really delivering, decarbonization benefits.
Okay, we'll just try and get through these last two questions relatively quickly before our next break. But if I could have that question, please.
Thanks very much, Matthew Greener from Arriva. Our procurement colleagues are normally targeted first with a savings number. How do you balance that with the need to reduce carbon and reduce emissions? And are you applying objectives within the procurement colleagues to reduce those carbon emissions as well?
Maybe I can kick off with that one from a procurement function. So answering the second question first, so around the objectives for the procurement function, this has been 2023 is the first year that we have set kind of a dedicated KPI as part of our procurement scorecard. So you'll see obviously cost savings up there, quality, risk and sustainability. So specific sustainable sourcing KPIs, carbon reduction, Scope 3 KPIs on there. So we're really trying to drive that kind of ownership, like you said, of putting that on there. I think next year in 2024, we will be setting objectives for specific procurement colleagues, whether they've got a big carbon impact in supplier, how are they measuring the reduction, etc. So I think that's something that we will be looking at. And then in terms of balancing that with cost, it is difficult. I think I mentioned earlier that that has been more the prime focus of a procurement function is to save that cost, is to drive value for the business. But I think it's looking at value in a slightly different way. So rather than getting a cheaper product per kilo, a pound cost per kilo, it's looking at what is the value going to drive for the business. So if you're going to, as part of your procurement decision making and category strategies, you should be speaking to your R&D teams, you should be speaking to your commercial teams anyway. So you should be asking them, what is the value or what is the loss if I don't get FSC certification? What would be the sales loss as part of that, for example? So it's trying to look at that more holistically, and I think it's definitely a mindset change as well. I think for leadership team, for the whole business to show that if there is an on-cost of sustainability price per kilo for this year, what is the revenue that we're going to get back from it in 5 years? It needs to be more strategic rather than looking at kind of year-on-year savings. So yeah, that's kind of the education that we're going through as well at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I could just quickly pick up on that in terms of, I think you said it, like it has to be strategic and you have to have a kind of roadmap with different solutions that some of them are going to be your quick cost efficient energy efficiency, right? That's going to create some savings. And then some of them are more long-term, like potentially procuring a renewable energy, PPA, a power procurement agreement like that. But yeah, it has to be part of a roadmap, and there's going to be different considerations and risks that you need to evaluate according to your business's strategy and philosophy, really.
And I think, sorry, just super quickly on the back of that, I think as well, just looking at your category and being innovative with it. So, for example, if you manage a packaging or a paper category, what can it, not just looking at the cost, but what can you do to drive down cost and sustainability? So can you have an impact on kind of design of that product? Can you remove some of the packaging, which is going to remove the cost and the sustainability impact? So kind of being, innovative with your strategy as well.
Okay, and I believe we just had one last question. If we can keep this as short and sharp as possible, I'd be very grateful. Charlie, just next to you, literally next to you.
Hi, I'm Olivia Mitchell, and I lead on sustainability marketing for both in business and the UK. I think we have identified across both customers' needs across different enterprise segments, but also within our supply chain, that to drive sustainability, technology is definitely a really key pillar of that, but also circular economy. So I'd just be really interested to hear either from how you're approaching customer conversations or within your supply chain and procurement, how you see the circular economy playing that key part to hit some of your sustainability goals.
Can I come back to the question about regulation? So batteries, for example, battery sustainability, there are some things that as you recycle them and you break them down, you can have a component that you can transport suddenly finally you break it down, it becomes hazardous waste. And it makes it really, really hard then. It puts friction in the cycle for creating a circular economy. So that's another place. Like some help, please. Sorry, I'll let someone else answer the question.
Maybe I could just quickly touch on circularity. We've seen that that's been one of the, from the work with our suppliers, we've seen that's been one of the really effective decarbonisation levers in terms of, looking at better circularity practices in purchasing goods and services and capital goods specifically. So that's something that, is really, really important.
Okay, well, we are slightly over time. We have a very brief networking break coming up. So I'd like to thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for your contributions. Rachel, Amy, Hannah, and Aleksandra. Round of applause, please.